really appreciate that you made an emphasis to come to this program. I don't think you'll be disappointed. So my name is Joan Peralt. I'm a member of the guidance staff, and on behalf of the guidance staff, I welcome you to this evening's program. I do want to make a public service announcement before we start. As any of you who are junior parents know, we're so happy to have snow days, but not when they come on junior parent college night, which snow days did twice, as it turns out. So we have rescheduled. You might have seen an email about it from me today. But the junior parent college night has been rescheduled to Thursday, March 23rd. We're pretty sure there won't be snow by then. And it will be at the same time. It starts with refreshments at 6 and the program begins at 6:30. But you'll continue to receive communications about that and your voice will be reminded as well. And then the Naviance training, which we also had to postpone, we'll offer it twice. And the first will be on Tuesday, May 28th at 2:45 in the afternoon. And then Wednesday, March 29th at 7:30. But once again, you'll get further communication about that, and hopefully you'll be able to attend. So this evening we have a really interesting speaker with us, and those of us on the guidance staff have had a chance to hear Drew once, if not many times, and I always learn something new from him. So Drew Heilpern graduated from Duke University with a dual degree in biology and elementary education. After teaching middle school science in North Carolina, Drew returned to Massachusetts for graduate school, where he earned his Ph.D. in immunology from Tufts University. After receiving the Ruth Gerstein National Research Award from the National Institute of Health, Drew began his postdoctoral fellowship for the study of Lyme disease. Soon after, Drew began tutoring for Summit, where his passion as an educator quickly made him one of Summit's most requested tutors. His passion for tutoring students and helping families navigate the standardized testing landscape led him to a full-time position with Summit, where he currently serves as Summit's Director of Educational Partnerships. So I'm happy to introduce Drew Heilpern to you. Thanks. Thanks, Drew.
All right, I'm going to try to do this without a mic, so just as a quick sound check, people in the back, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
People in the front, am I screaming at you? No. All right, perfect. Joan, thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks everybody for coming out in this slightly Arctic weather. We appreciate it. So, a couple goals tonight. One goal is hopefully to just ratchet down some of the anxiety around standardized testing. I know when you see this, the number 2 pencils, and starting to bubble in answer choices, everyone's anxiety immediately starts to ratchet up. But at the end of the day, this really is just a test, so we try not to put more kind of emphasis than it deserves. And also, it's a theme you'll hear me come back to over and over again throughout this evening's presentation, but your son's lives do not depend on their SAT or ACT scores. They're not going to be living in a van down by a river according to how well they do on this test. Other couple things just before we get into this. I think everybody picked up one of these on the table up there. A lot of the information that I'm covering tonight is in the testing guide, so if you need to go back and refer to something, chances are it's going to be in here. Also, I did put a printout of the presentation, so if you want to take notes or follow along or know your presentation future in terms of what's coming next, you can look at that handout. Also, if you're not aware, Summit, we're in Newton. We do offer free proctored practice tests every weekend in our Newton office. And the schedule of those proctored practice tests are also, I put a handout in there. So if you're interested in taking advantage of those, I encourage you to take advantage of those. Just give us a call and set those up. Also, my business card is in there, so just if you have questions or want to email me or call me, feel free to reach out at any point. All right, a couple other goals in addition to sort of hopefully ratcheting down some of the anxiety around this is I just want to go over the tests, the SAT and the ACT in particular, at a very high level, just so you get a sense for what those tests are like. And also then we'll drill down and just kind of do a side-by-side comparison of them, just so you get a better feel in terms of what the SAT now looks like, because it is not the SAT that we all took and that we all know and love. And especially here in New England, many of us are still not that familiar with the ACT. So I just want to go over the ACT a little bit as well. But before I dive into this, and just giving people a chance to get settled here, just by a quick show of hands, how many of you in the room have gone through the college admissions process before? All right, so how many of you have not? First time through it. All right, so most of you. So one of the things you're going to need through this process is a little bit of courage. So for those of you who have not gone through this before, as I'm talking, you have to keep your hand up. So one more time, those of you who have not gone through this before, you got to raise your hand high and keep them up. Okay, so the one homework assignment, for those of you, you got to keep them up. The one homework assignment for those of you who have gone through this before is you have to find someone in this room who has their hand up and reassure them that everything is going to be fine. Everything will be fine. All right. And with that, we'll dive in. All right. I start the presentation with this slide because this is probably the #1 question that I get at these presentations, and I just want to preempt it. And that question goes as follows. So Drew, there's 2 standardized tests now that colleges accept, the SAT and the ACT. We're coming from the Northeast. Can my son really get into his first choice college by just submitting an ACT score? And the answer to that question is yes. He absolutely can. So if there's one take-home message I want you to remember from this is that colleges accept both of these tests equally. The ACT is not seen as a lesser test. It is not seen as an inferior test in any way, shape, or form. And you can see just from these numbers here, in terms of market share, actually there's more administrations nationally of the ACT than the SAT. Just out of curiosity, any parents in the room, did any of you take the ACT as your college admissions test? All right. Are any of you in this room from Illinois? No. Ohio? There we go. We found our Ohio person. Michigan? Okay, we found our Michigan person. All right. The reason why I'm guessing Midwest states is, historically speaking, the ACT has always been a test from the Midwest. Most students taking the ACTs were Midwest students, whereas the SAT more of an East Coast, West Coast type of test, which is why for all of you who did not put your hands up and took the SAT, I'm guessing you were probably either in New England on the East Coast or on the West Coast. But those dynamics have completely changed. More and more of our students are taking the ACT, and more students from the Midwest are taking the SAT. Again, just to hammer it home, colleges do not care. At the end of the day, what kind of your job is, or your student's job is to figure out which test is going to be better for him, and then kind of going down that path. And again, just going back to that theme of these tests are not the be-all, end-all of the college admissions process. The most important thing that colleges look at when they're evaluating applicants is their grades in school. Just that transcript, their day in and day out performance in school. The second thing that they look at is rigor of transcript. Did the students take advantage of the opportunities presented to them? And then depending on how you do the math on this, either the third or fourth most important thing that colleges look at for those colleges that consider standardized testing scores are in fact the standardized testing scores. But colleges, it's called a holistic review. They do evaluate everything and they do consider everything when they're making those admit, reject, or waitlist decisions. So included in that, in addition to the grades and the transcript and the standardized testing piece, all of these are also weighted. So even those colleges that are getting 30,000 plus applications from students, they are reading the essays from all those applicants. They are reading the counselor recommendations. They are looking at students' extracurricular activities and positions of leadership. And all of that is what goes into that final decision. Not just trying to get those students down to kind of a number with their standardized testing scores or their GPA. The other thing that I'll mention here, and this is kind of in the sort of urban legend category, is, and Joan can back me up on this, we talk to a lot of college admissions officers. They do read these applications supportively, so they are looking for reasons to accept students, not just looking for reasons to reject them. And I direct this, I know there's some students in the room, so I'll direct this to them. At the end of the day, this college admission process, it does kind of come down in numbers at times. So I always tell my students as they're working through this, obviously you want to do the best you can with it. Obviously you want to put your best foot forward. But at the end of the day, it's not a personal decision that they're making. Oftentimes, they would have loved to have accepted you. You probably had an admissions officer on that committee advocating for you, but just for whatever reason, the numbers didn't break in your favor. So for instance, on the most competitive schools, again, they're getting 30,000 plus applications for a class of 1,600. So if it doesn't go your way, you can't take that decision personally. It's not an indication of your self-worth in any way, shape, or form. It's not an indication of how hard you worked, and it's certainly not an indication of the success that you're going to have in life and later in life. Really, at the end of the day, they would have loved to offer you a spot, just for whatever reason, because of those numbers, they just didn't have that spot. So anything you can do to not sort of personalize that decision down the road can be helpful in terms of not being sort of devastated when these decisions come in. All right. The other trend that's gaining momentum is more and more schools are going test optional, especially when the SAT was redesigned and went into effect last spring. A lot of schools who were kind of on the fence as to whether or not to go test optional decided that, you know what, why are we banging our head against the wall trying to understand what these standardized test scores mean, trying to figure out how predictive they're actually going to be, and more schools are going test optional. And it's not just sort of smaller, more rural schools that we've never heard of. More and more competitive schools are test optional. The two that immediately come to mind that are increasingly on students' lists are Holy Cross is a test optional school out in Worcester, and Wake Forest is actually a test optional school. So what test optional means is exactly as it sounds. It's up to you to decide whether or not you're going to send those standardized testing scores. And if you decide not to send those standardized testing scores for whatever reason, it's not a black mark. It doesn't raise any red flags. Essentially, the admissions officers evaluates that applicant based on all those other criteria without having to evaluate those standardized testing scores. The one caveat to the test optional schools is if you're interested in merit aid. So merit aid is generally non-need-based financial aid awards. If you're interested in merit aid and you're applying to a test optional school, some schools that admit test optionally, when they are making those merit aid awards, they do still consider standardized testing scores. So if you're applying to a test optional school, but you're interested in possibly being considered for merit aid awards, just ask them. If they're very upfront about this, you can just ask them, hey, we're interested in merit aid. Do you consider standardized testing scores in those awards, yes or no, and they'll tell you. Also, if you go to the fairtest.org website, they have a list of all the schools that are test optional, and the ones that are test optional but consider standardized testing scores for that merit aid award, they have a little asterisk by it. But again, that list is constantly changing, so I would recommend that you either check with the college counseling office here, who are fantastic, or just call the admissions folk at that school to double check it. And again, they're not trying to hide anything from you. They'll be very open with you in terms of whether or not they consider those scores for those awards. So then the question I always get is, all right, Drew, so clearly standardized testing, right, not the be-all, end-all of the college admissions process. More and more schools and more competitive schools are going test optional. So why am I up here today in 2017? Why are you all here tonight? Like, why are we still talking about standardized testing scores? And there's a couple pressures at play that are maintaining the standardized testing piece as part of the college admission process. And one of them is just more and more international students are looking to apply to our U.S. college system and get into essentially our U.S. education system. And admissions officers at colleges are increasingly faced with applicants from international schools where they've had no history with that school. So they've never had an applicant from that school, and they've never admitted anyone from that school. So the standardized testing piece for those college admissions officers is just another data point for them. Obviously, it's still on this bell curve that we all kind of know and love. It does give them, again, an objective measure just to kind of put the rest of that application and that transcript and the recommendations into a little bit of context for them. And similarly, in the US, more and more students are on a college track. So similar type of situation where admissions officers, even from applicants in the US, might be more rural areas. Again, they have no history with that school. So they just, again, the standardized testing piece does give them another objective data point to evaluate their transcript and the other parts of that application. And that's where coming from BC High is so nice, because I can probably say this with almost 100% confidence that every college and university in the country knows BC High, knows the rigor of the curriculum here, knows the quality of education that your sons are getting. So again, not that for those schools that require standardized testing, right, not that they're going to totally not look at them, but again, it does speak to the strength of that transcript and the strength of that of the students' overall application. And then I'm going to throw a ton of information at you in a relatively short amount of time. Don't feel like you have to hang on my every word. Obviously, I'll feel flattered if you do. But really the point of this is to just kind of get sort of the gist of it and kind of get the high level, kind of the gestalt of it. Also, generally, if you can keep questions to the end, just in terms of keeping us moving through this presentation, it can be helpful. But if you're that person that just, you've just thought of the greatest question of all time, like no one has thought of a question as great as the question that you thought of, and you're not actually going to pay attention to what's happening up here or listen to me, all you're going to be thinking about is how great this question is, and you can't wait to ask it. And I'm totally that person, so I totally relate to that. Feel free to just ask the question. You're not going to throw me off my game in any way, shape, or form, so don't hesitate. But if you can hold the questions to the end, just in terms of pacing, it will help us get through this. All right. So again, I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. If you only remember one slide from this talk, this is the slide I want you to remember. At the end of the day, helping students hit their full potential on these tests really comes down to having a testing plan. And that testing plan consists of just 3 simple questions. Which tests should I take? When am I going to take them? And then how and when am I going to prepare for them? And the reason why this gives students such an advantage is these tests, they are national tests, so they're being taken by students throughout the country. And still in today's day and age, a vast majority of students still kind of walk into these tests cold. They just wake up on a Saturday morning and their mom or dad or guardian tells them, hey, you're taking the SAT today. Good luck. And they kind of walk in, they might not even really understand what's on that test or what the different sections of it or how it's scored or anything about it. They kind of walk in, take it cold, and just kind of let the chips fall. But if your son can actually answer these 3 questions, again, it just gives them a little bit of an advantage. Also, the one thing that I want to stress with that testing plan is there's no right or wrong way to do this. Really, at the end of the day, that testing plan, the best testing plan is what works best for you and you as a family and for your sons. And the other thing that I always encourage, especially my juniors, who are the junior parents in the room? All right, I'll direct this to you. I'll direct it to the sophomore parents too. Anything you can do to kind of drown out the noise in all of this can be helpful in terms of reducing some of the anxiety. There is a huge movement now for early and often testing, right? Just start earlier and earlier and earlier and keep testing, testing, testing. We'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but really, statistically speaking, students hit their best scores in late spring of junior year or fall of senior year, because performance on these tests, it does correlate with age and maturity, and also just time spent in school. So as you're thinking about that testing plan, like at the end of the day, the best testing plan is what works best for you. So don't worry if a neighbor or a close friend or a sibling's kids have done something totally different. It's totally fine. So don't let that kind of ratchet up the anxiety when you talk to a neighbor and they're like, yeah, we started after summer of 8th grade and we've already been working at this for 2 years. And there are times when that might actually be a good plan, but don't worry if that's not the path that you're going down. All right, so which tests? So these are in the standardized testing landscape, these are the tests that we're talking about. PSAT, which I'll talk about briefly. SAT, ACT is going to be the bulk of this. I will talk about subject tests briefly just because there are a lot of questions that inevitably come up around subject tests. And then AP tests, which we won't get into tonight, but if you have questions about APs or anything, Joan, I'm sure can answer them as well. So the PSAT, I'll start there. For the juniors, they got those results back in December. Cannot stress this enough, that P in PSAT is preliminary. We like to think of it as standing for practice. Colleges do not care about a student's PSAT scores. Most likely, if the student's not a national merit, if they didn't get commendation or be a national merit semifinalist or finalist, they're not even going to see those PSAT scores. No admissions decisions are based on a student's PSAT scores. Where the value of the PSAT comes from is twofold. One, anytime students get the opportunity to take a real test under real conditions, especially under practice conditions where it doesn't really count, it's always helpful just to give them exposure to that experience. And then two, the real value of the PSAT is in that score report. It's not so much the score, like don't get hung up on the score so much, because again, students hit their best scores in late spring of junior year or fall of senior year. So taking it in October of junior year, and if they've taken the PSAT 10 in October of sophomore year, it's a little bit early to be taking these tests. So really the value of the PSAT comes in not in terms of the score, but in having students actually go back and look at those questions that they got wrong and go back to the test booklet, which they do have a copy of, and really looking for any trends or finding any areas of weaknesses or topics that they feel like they need to hone up on. That's where the value of that PSAT comes from. And also, I just want to talk about the scoring real quickly on this. You can see the three different types of tests that the SATs offers, that PSAT 8, 9, PSAT 10, which is again what sophomores take in October of their sophomore year. That PSAT NMS QT test, that's the one that the 11th graders take, and then obviously the SAT. So the SAT is on that 200 to 800 point scale that we all know and love. And you can see here that PSAT and PSAT NMS QT is on that 160 to 760 scale. So the question I always get is, all right, Drew, so the PSAT is only at a 760 instead of 800. So I know the scores aren't, that important, but still when I see those scores on that PSAT, because it's only out of 760, can I just add 40 points to each of the sections, and that would be the score that my son would get if he were to take an SAT? And the answer to that is unfortunately no, you can't do that. We won't go into too much detail on this, but you can see kind of the way this graph is created. These tests are all what they call vertically aligned in terms of their scoring. So what that means is on that PSAT, for example, if a student got a 600 on that math section, that 600 on the math is the score that they would have gotten on that math SAT had they taken the SAT on that day instead of the PSAT. So when you look at those PSAT scores, again, I don't want you to put too much weight in them, but that is, you can read that as sort of their PSAT score, where they are in October of junior year on that SAT. And then just at a high level, I do just want to try to give you a little bit of context as we start going through the SAT and ACT. So at a really high level, when standardized test makers create a standardized test, there's kind of two components that go into the design of that standardized test. The first is just aptitude versus curriculum-based testing. So aptitude test in its purest form, we think of that as being sort of like an IQ test, measuring, quote, the student's innate ability to learn. Whereas a curriculum-based test, exactly as it sounds, more in line with what students are asked to do day in and day out in school, more in line with the testing that they'd be asked to do here at BC High. The other component that goes into the design of the standardized test is just speed versus power. So power kind of speaks to the complexity of questions, the difficulty of the questions on the test, whereas speed is exactly as it sounds. Just the difficulty of a speeded test is just can students get through that test in the time allotted. So not to bring back any kind of vicious SAT kind of flashback memories for all of you, but that old, what I'm calling that old PSAT and old SAT, that SAT that we all took by design very much an aptitude test, very much a power test. So as you might remember from your own experience taking the SAT, tons of misdirection on that SAT, a lot of trying to make things seem much more challenging than they actually were, a lot of sort of tricky questions where they're trying to intentionally steer students towards a wrong answer. When students were 50-50 on that old SAT or old PSAT, so when I was working with students on that test, there was a lot of helping students simplify the questions and more importantly, get inside the test taker's head and really understand what makes a right answer right and a wrong answer wrong. Particularly when they got it down to 50-50 and were like, Drew, there's two right answers to this. Like, I can defend both of these answers. And then just again, helping them realize there's only one right answer and one of these is wrong. Why is that answer choice wrong? With that redesign that went into effect last spring, so March of 2016, one of the goals of that redesign was to kind of move away from sort of this sort of aptitude component of it and to make it more of a curriculum-based test, to make it more accessible for students, to make the test seem a little bit less sort of random and esoteric to students, to make it more sort of in line with what students are asked to do day in and day out in school. Having said that, it's still an SAT, it's still created by the College Board, it still has what I call SAT-ness to it, it's still a power test, it still has a little bit of misdirection on it, it still has that kind of trickiness component to it, but not to the extent that old SAT had, that SAT that we all knew and loved had. And then by comparison, the ACT was created about in the 1950s. It was created to be in direct competition with the SAT. So because the SAT by design was designed to be an aptitude power test, the ACT intentionally wanted to go in a different direction. So that ACT, more along the lines of a speed test, and historically speaking, that ACT has always been more of a curriculum-based test. So what that means is for students who walk out of an ACT, they often walk out of it and feel like, Drew, I didn't think it was that bad. The questions felt a little bit more straightforward, which is why the ACT kind of has a reputation, especially around here, as being, quote, an easier test. Because those questions are more straightforward, because they're more accessible to students, because a little bit more aligned with the curriculum, it just has that reputation of being, quote, easier. It's not easier. And the reason why it's not easier is because that student walks out of there and says, yeah, Drew, I found it a little bit more straightforward, especially if they've taken an SAT as well. And then here comes the kicker where they say, I just wish I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section. If I had another 5 or 10 minutes per section, I really felt like I would have crushed this. But that's where the difficulty of the ACT comes from. They don't have that extra 5 or 10 minutes that they feel like they need. So to give you an example on it, on that reading section on the ACT, that reading section is 35 minutes, it's 40 questions, it's 4 passages, 10 questions per passage. So the breakdown of that is about 8.5 to 8 3/4 minutes per passage, which breaks down further to about 4 to 4.5 minutes to read and understand a pretty lengthy passage. And students can't just skim it, you actually have to read it for understanding, which then gives them about 4 or 4.5 minutes to answer 10 questions. And they got to keep that pace up for that full 35-minute section. Not an easy thing to do, and just a total sprint from start to finish. So here's a side-by-side comparison of the tests, just to give you a feel for them. They're both long, 3 hours and 50 minutes on that SAT, 3 hours and 35 minutes on that ACT. In terms of the scoring, the SAT's gone back to that 1,600 point scale that we all know and love. So 200 to 800 on what they call an evidence-based reading and writing section. It's a bit of a mouthful, I just call that the verbal section of the SAT. But that verbal section is a combined score between that reading and writing and language, which is just the grammar portion of it. And then half the test on the SAT is that math. Again, 200 to 800. And then that essay is optional. We'll talk about this in a minute. We generally recommend that when students register for either the ACT or the SAT, that they go ahead and register for it with the essay. And I'll come back to that point in a minute. The ACT, if you're not familiar with the ACT scoring, it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's It's on a 1 through 36 scale. So that English section, again, the grammar, math, reading, and science, again, which we'll talk about, all scored on that 1 through 36 scale. And then the composite score for the ACT, so on the SAT, the composite score is just out of 1600. Essentially, they're adding that verbal and math score and combining it out of that 1600 point scale. Whereas the ACT, their composite score is an average. So they're taking the English, math, reading, and science scores, adding them all up, dividing them by 4. They do round up, and that's then the composite score that the student sees on that particular test. So just in terms of that side-by-side comparison of them, they both obviously have a reading section. Again, speaking to the power component of the reading section on that SAT, that is a 65-minute reading section, which is just a bear for students. So for 65 straight minutes, they have to read pretty complicated passages and answer questions on it, and keep that focus for that full 65 minutes. And again, more speed on the ACT, just 35 minutes on that reading. It sounds a little friendlier, but again, the pace of that section is incredibly fast. I'm going to date myself a little bit with this reference. The writing and language on the SAT and English on the ACT, this is the grammar portions of the test. So this is back to Warner's Book of Grammar, for those of us who worked through that book, or Strunk and White's Element of Style, for those of us who are familiar with those. It's more pure editing. Students are given passages where they have grammatical errors throughout, and as students read through those passages, they just have to correct those grammatical errors as they go through it. You can see here they both have math, obviously. No calculator section on the math. Again, another section that causes anxiety for students, and I'm guilty of this in today's day and age. We're all so calculator dependent. So the College Board, they're not just trying to torment kids and be like, hey, let's see how well you do without a calculator. They're trying to test math fluency. So what they're trying to test is students' true understanding of math, not just can students grab a calculator, put in numbers, really have no idea what they're doing, and find an answer, but do they actually understand how to find slope of the line? Do they actually understand what they're finding when they find slope of the line, and what slope of the line actually means? And again, calculator section for that second part of it. Math on the ACT, calculator section allowed throughout, but again, the difficulty comes from the speed of it. 60 minutes, 60 questions on that math section. So about 1 minute per question that students have to work their way through. Reading we've already discussed. Science on the ACT, it's not really science. They're not going to ask you, like, what's the chemical formula of photosynthesis. It's more deductive reasoning and logic. Students are going to be presented with scientific passages of which they know nothing about. And really what this section is asking those students to do is, can they interpret the data? Can they look at the figures in the graphs and try to get an understanding of what that passage is about? Again, knowledge of scientific method here is helpful. Also, if they've been exposed to lab science and kind of know how controls and things work, again, it can be helpful in that section. Which then brings us to the essay. Only about 14% of colleges are requiring the essay, but we recommend that students register and take these tests with the essay just as a hedge. And the reason for that is just we don't want our seniors, they put their college list together, none of those colleges require the essay, and they're like, great, because I didn't take the ACT with the essay, and then at the last minute they decide to add a school, and then they suddenly realize that that school is requiring the essay, and now they're scrambling to try to take this test potentially one more time just to fulfill that requirement. You'll see when we get to it later in the talk, colleges are not putting, even those colleges that are requiring these essay scores, they're really not putting any weight on it. But again, there are schools that are requiring it. The other reason why I want students to go ahead and register with the essay is you might think to yourself, oh, it's probably just the most competitive schools, right? Probably just the Ivy Leagues that are requiring the essay. It's not the case. The list of schools that are requiring the essay are all over the board in terms of sort of competitiveness. So some Ivy Leagues require it, some don't. There's some community colleges out there that actually require it. I think it's more for placement purposes. But again, you can't just sort of look at a list of schools, get a sense of their competitiveness, and based on that competitiveness, have any idea as to whether or not they're going to be requiring the essay or not. So just as a hedge, we always recommend that students go ahead and register for these tests with the essay. And this essay score, it's totally a standalone score. It's not factored into the composite score for either the SAT or the ACT. And again, colleges are not putting any weight on those essay scores. So just to kind of give you a feel, we'll dive in now and just kind of do a side-by-side comparison of questions on the SAT and ACT, just to give you a feel for kind of how speed versus power kind of actually plays out on this test. So the writing and language on the SAT and English on the ACT, these are the two sections that are probably most similar to one another. Again, this is the pure editing grammar rule portion of both tests. On the SAT, because it's more of a power test, there's a little bit of a greater emphasis on students' actual reading for understanding and understanding the author's intent and the author's main point of view. And again, on the SAT, there's going to be something called data graphics. If you remember back from that previous slide, the SAT did not have a separate science section. So the way they're testing science is they're trying to incorporate science questions throughout the test. And according to the SAT, kind of what doing science is your ability to interpret a table. So even though we're on a grammar portion or the writing portion of the test, there's going to be a table there that students are going to be asked to sort of interpret what that table means and quote show sort of their quote proficiency in science. And again, more time for question on the SAT versus the ACT. So here's what it looks like. We won't actually work through it. So here you can see forms is underlined, kind of a subject-verb agreement error there. Here, looking at the answer choices, again, punctuation error. Do students understand the proper use of a colon or a semicolon? And here's what it looks like on the SAT. Again, almost identical. We always kind of joke that the SAT kind of ripped off the ACT in their redesign when they were designing this section. So much so, in fact, that apparently the College Board didn't have a thesaurus or couldn't come up with a synonym for no change, because that's the way it looks on the SAT, and on the ACT, it's no change. And again, this is the SAT asking students to prove they know how to do science by throwing in that table. And then again, more of a power test on the SAT. So in addition to students being asked to interpret this table and be able to understand it, they're also going to be asked kind of how this data fits into context with the rest of that passage. Which then brings us to the reading. We've already kind of discussed this. Really, all you need to know about the differences between the SAT and ACT reading is that timing. So on the SAT, it's 65 minutes. There's 5 passages, so it's 13 minutes per passage. Whereas on that ACT, 35 minutes, 4 passages, 8.5 to 8 3/4 minutes per passage. Huge difference in the world of standardized testing between having 13 minutes on a passage and having 8.5 or 8 3/4 minutes on a passage. So just by that timing, you can probably guess that SAT is going to ask students to do a closer reading, a more inferential reading, a more nuanced reading. Whereas on the ACT, they just don't have time for those types of questions. Much more efficient, more bigger picture. Did the student read and understand what the passage was about? Did the student understand the argument that the author was making? Did the student understand the intent? What's the author's point in creating this? So we won't actually look at passages or more specific questions, but again, it gives you a feel for it. So on that SAT, lots of questions, something like this: what can reasonably be inferred? And then there's going to be a follow-up question, which is which choice provides the best evidence. So again, forcing students to do a closer reading. Students are going to have to go back into that passage and find the line numbers that actually led them to that answer. Whereas on the ACT, they just don't have time for that. More questions along the lines of the passage points to this. Can students find those answers that really show that they read and understood the passage in that kind of rushed environment or short amount of time? Which then brings us to everybody's favorite topic, math. So on the SAT, a much narrower and deeper focus in terms of the math that's covered. So on the SAT, 60 to 70% of the math on that SAT is algebra. So algebra 1 and algebra 2. Not a random decision that the College Board made. They didn't just suddenly wake up and be like, hey, let's make 60 to 70% of our math on our SAT algebra 1 or algebra 2. Where this came from is they surveyed colleges and they asked, okay, for your students who are doing well in introductory math courses or who are going on to more advanced math courses, what backgrounds did they have? And the colleges came back with they had a solid foundation in algebra. So that's what's driving that change to the test. So obviously if they're going to emphasize something, they have to de-emphasize something. So what got de-emphasized was geometry. Geometry is less than 10% of the math that's on the SAT. Again, we already talked about it, that no calculator section, testing students' math fluency, do they actually understand the math behind the math? And again, SAT, more of a power test, more time per question compared to the ACT. ACT, just broader and shallower, more topics are covered. Algebra 1 and 2 are essentially about 30% of the math that's on the ACT. So way more geometry on that ACT compared to the SAT, and again, that calculator allowed throughout. Again, the difficulty often comes from the pace of it. It's an incredibly fast-paced section. So we'll just go through this quickly. I won't call on anybody to answer these, but it does kind of highlight the difference in terms of what a powered question looks like versus what a speed question looks like. So on the SAT, they're both about slope of the line. I'm just going to read it just so you kind of hear it and get a feel for it. But the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at a0 and 0b in the xy plane. If a plus b equals 0 and a doesn't equal b, which of the following is true about the slope of the graph of f? Especially when I read it that way, most students have the same reaction that we all have, which is, what? I have no idea what that's even asking. It's actually not that bad a question, but again, this is where the power comes in and a little bit of misdirection comes in. Really what they're asking is, can students find the slope of the line given 2 points? So they could have worded this, the graph of the linear function f has intercepts at -2, 0 and 0, 2. What is the slope of this line? And if they phrased it that way, most students, that would be a much more accessible question for kids. Most students would read that and be like, oh, I know how to find the slope of the line between 2 points. It's actually not that bad. But this is where the power comes in. This is where the misdirection comes in. For students to realize that that's really all this question is asking, they have to go in and they have to figure out what on earth this is talking about and how this relates to this. Whereas on the ACT, they're just less interested in playing this game. It's more of a straightforward question. The slope of one of the lines is 3, and they're asking for the slope of the perpendicular line. You either know this or you don't. I won't put anyone on the spot. Does anyone remember this? You can shout it out. C, very good. Yes, it is C. So you either remember that perpendicular lines have negative reciprocal slopes, or you don't. If you remember that, if you do remember that, it's roughly a 20 to 30 second type of question. You read this, you know the answer, it's C, and you move on. If you don't remember that, there's no way to logic your way to this answer. There's nothing really to figure out. You either know it or you don't. Again, just sort of highlighting the difference between a power type of question versus speed type of question. Which then brings us to the science. Again, on the SAT, no separate science questions. 21 sort of science-related questions are embedded throughout. Again, a little bit forced. On the ACT, it does have that separate science section. Again, not asking you for the chemical formula of photosynthesis. More deductive reasoning and logic. Can students kind of work their way through a passage that they've never seen before and kind of try to figure out what's going on. So here's what it looks like on the ACT. By design, it does kind of take students' breath away a little bit the first time they see it. It is a little bit overwhelming. I have no idea what an asthenosphere is. I have no idea what a lithosphere is. I don't actually have to know any of that in order to be able to answer this question. What I do need to be able to do is obviously read the question. So according to figure 1, the temperature of the outer core is approximately between, well, I know figure 1 is this, obviously, because it's only one here. The outer core, I know is there. I know how to read a graph, so I know I'm on the y-axis here on that temperature. I know I'm between these two sort of dashed lines, which are the boundaries of the outer core. So I know the answer is here between 4,800 and 6,300, answer choice C. I have no idea what I found. I really don't know what that means, but I know that that answer choice is C. And this is where the ACT can be challenging for students and for all of us if you ever try an ACT, is it has a tendency to turn on your OCD even when you don't have OCD. And the reason for that is because it's such a fast-paced test, students are working through this at a pace that is generally faster than what they're comfortable working with. So there is just this little voice in the back of your head that goes something like, wow, Drew, you did that awfully quickly. Are you sure that answer choice is C? And if I give into that voice, I'm going to double check this, or triple check this, or quadruple check this, and I just don't have time for that. So a lot of the practice on the ACT is about just raising students' confidence that they can do a problem like this, circle answer choice C, and move on quickly without second guessing or doubting themselves. Which then brings us to the essay. At this point, most students are kind of feeling like this. It gets even worse when they read that SAT prompt. So what that SAT prompt is asking students to do is they're asking students to read a 500 to 650 word argument, and those students are not asked whether or not they agree or disagree with the author's argument or the author's point of view, but rather what rhetorical devices did the author use to make his or her point, and was he or she successful? So for the rhetoric majors in the room, it's back to Aristotle's triangle of rhetoric, like ethos and pathos. Their students don't actually have to use those terms in their essay. If they know them, they can show off a little bit and throw them in there. But really what the College Board is looking for is they're looking for the author's use of metaphoric language, so either similes or metaphors, their use of exaggeration, appeal to emotion, citing an authority. That's the type of examples that they're looking for. And again, this is what I say, colleges are not putting any weight, even those that require them, on this essay. Because as you can imagine, the College Board, they're just going to get thousands and thousands and thousands of essays that are like, yeah, I thought the author was convincing, because before I read her argument, I wasn't convinced. And now I'm convinced. And then they're going to look at the clock and be like, oh my gosh, I have 48 more minutes. What on earth am I going to write about for 48 minutes? The ACT essay is a little bit more forgiving. It is a persuasive essay, so students are going to be asked their opinion or point of view. It's generally a topic around something in the sort of current events type of field, like should GMO foods be banned, yes or no. They are looking for a clear opinion from the students, so yes, GMO foods should be banned, or no, they should not be banned. And then students are going to be given 3 different perspectives on that issue that they're then asked to incorporate throughout their essay. And again, colleges aren't putting a lot of weight on these essays, but just as a hedge, we always recommend that students go ahead when they register for these tests and kind of have a crack at this. All right, which then, just in terms of summarizing this part of the talk, when the SAT redesign was first announced and went into effect last spring, there was a lot of publicity around it of being, oh, this is just ACT 2.0. And the reason for that is just there's 4 answer choices on the SAT instead of 5. There's no guessing penalty on that on the SAT now. So the SAT that we all took and knew and loved, right? 5 answer choices, a quarter point off for every answer you got wrong. So you have to kind of play that game of, should I guess? Should I skip it? When should I guess? On both the ACT and SAT, there are no penalties for wrong answers, so students should not leave anything blank. If they have no idea what an SAT question is asking, they should just choose their favorite SAT letter and move on. If they run out of time on the ACT in a section, they should just choose their favorite ACT letter and bubble it all the way down. Also, that writing test on that SAT looks almost identical to that ACT English section. Again, both are more curriculum-based tests rather than sort of IQ tests or achievement tests. And again, a little bit forced on the SAT for that incorporation of science throughout. But having gone through what we just went through, it's not the same test. So SAT questions, a little bit more challenging, more of a power test, a deeper understanding, more inferential type of reading on the reading passage section, narrower focus of skills, especially on the math with that focus on algebra, and again, more of a power test, more time for question. Whereas ACT, more straightforward, requires instant recognition, a broader scope of skills, again, especially on the math, more geometry compared to the SAT, and again, it's a total sprint from start to finish. Which then brings me to this, which is always like, all right, Drew, that's all well and good, but which text? And there's tons and tons and tons of urban legend out there in terms of which test is right for which type of student. But at the end of the day, the best way to make this decision is to have students try both tests. And again, this is where I encourage you, if students are thinking maybe I might want to try the ACT, take advantage of the free proctor practice test that we offer every weekend in our Newton office, so that the first time that they try an ACT is not actually the real thing. They can come into our office and actually try it, just so they get a sense of the pacing of that test. 70 to 80% of students are going to score equally well on both the SAT and the ACT, so often which test to kind of focus on often comes down to gut instinct. Which test did the student prefer? Without overthinking this, I just asked them just point blank, which one did they prefer, or sometimes I phrase it as, which one did they hate least? Which one are they more comfortable with? If they're going to do some prep on it, which one would they rather prep for? Which one do they think they're going to have an easier time getting that score up on? So again, 70 to 80% of students score equally well, but there are a small percentage of students, around 20%, who do have a scoring bias for one test or the other. So it is worth exploring to see if your student has one of those scoring sort of biases. And then when to take them. So here are all the test dates, and then that one word of advice that I'd like to give you for that testing plan: try to make that testing plan sensible. There is no reason to take these tests 5 or 6 times. Please don't do that. No one wants you to do that, but as you can see from the testing dates, you can. So that February 11th ACT is already passed, but you can see, hey, we got a March SAT, and then an April ACT, and a May SAT, and a June SAT, and a June ACT, and hey, we've come this far. Why not in the fall? We can also do October, right? There's no need, right? At the end of the day, that testing plan, 2 things. We want to try to make it sensible, and 2, try to make it as efficient as you can. So generally speaking, it's not recommended to try to switch back and forth between tests. So for instance, trying to prep for, say, a March SAT, then switching and trying to do work on an April ACT, then switching back and doing a May SAT, and then switching back and doing a June ACT. It's just not efficient. So that's why we generally recommend that students can try to find that test that they feel like they're going to focus on, knowing that all work that they do on one test, it's going to help with the other tests. Again, both tests are curriculum-based tests. A lot of the content on both tests is similar. So if they end up, focusing, on the ACT, and then they end up switching or trying an SAT, it's not like all that work or all that time they spent on the SAT was a waste of time. It's going to help them on that ACT. So here's just a sample plan, just to kind of give you a feel for it. Again, our most common sort of testing plan is generally we're looking for juniors to take it kind of twice, in spring of junior year, and then knowing that they have the fall of senior year to try it one more time if they need it. And most students hit their best score after 2 or 3 times. Most students aren't one and done on this, just because the first time that they take it, they're always they're a little bit nervous. And then just about subject tests, you can't take subject tests and the SAT on the same day, so just keep that in mind if you have subject tests on your radar. And again, the College Counseling Office here is great in terms of recommendations, in terms of which subject tests might be appropriate for your student, if they even need them. But again, you can't take them both on the same day. Not that you want to. It's like 8 hours of testing if you ended up doing that. So subject tests, they're kind of on sort of their last legs in some ways. Like, most colleges do not require subject tests. It's only the most competitive ones that are still requiring them. And of the most competitive ones, some will take the ACT in lieu of subject tests. So if you submit an ACT score, that fulfills the requirement for subject tests. And again, not all subject tests are given on all test dates. That's mostly some of the language ones with listening. They're only offered in, I believe it's either October or November in a calendar year. And then again, they cannot be, they're administered on SAT test dates, so you can't take both. And you can register for up to 3 subject tests on any given testing administration. And the subject tests, you might know them as achievement tests. They've also been called SAT-2s. These are just their hour-long multiple choice questions in these various areas. But again, back to the idea that subject tests, they're dying in some ways. You can see sort of the trend in terms of the number of schools that are requiring them. It's only 12 now, and of those 12, 5 will take the ACT in lieu of them. The one caveat, or not caveat, but the one thing to keep in mind with that subject test They have not been redesigned in any way, shape, or form. The College Board is not looking at subject tests or looking at revising them. There is still 5 answer choices on those subject tests. There's still that guessing penalty on the subject tests. So students, if they have no idea what one of the questions is asking, they should skip it. Whereas on the SAT, don't leave anything blank. And then just real quickly, because this question comes up, because oftentimes I get, hey Drew, my son's in AP Bio this year. He's going to take the AP Bio exam. Does he have to take the subject test as well? And the answer to that is if you're looking at schools that require subject tests, they will not take an AP score in lieu of a subject test score. So think of it as killing 2 birds with 1 stone. All that work that they're doing to prepare for that AP test, it's going to help with the bio subject test. Go ahead and register for that bio subject test as well if you're looking at one of these schools that's requiring that. And then I just want to go over just a couple of quick terms, just because you'll hear them in these application processes. One is just score choice. So there's kind of 2 camps of schools on this. This is a testing policy that the colleges actually set. So for schools that honor score choice, and most schools do honor score choice, you decide which test scores they see. So for example, if your student took the SAT twice, and the first time that they took it, it didn't go so well, for schools that honor score choice, you don't actually have to send that first SAT score. You can just send the higher right down. There are some schools out there that are requiring all scores. Not entirely clear why they're requiring all scores. Partly it's they're trying to get ahead of serial testing. No one wants students to take this 5 or 6 times. So by requiring all scores, they're hoping to get ahead of that a little bit. And also, some schools that are requiring all scores, they are in fact super scoring. So what super scoring means is for those colleges that super score, if students have taken this test more than once, what they'll do is they'll cherry pick the highest subsection scores from different administrations of the test and essentially recalculate that composite score based on those highest subsection scores. So it's almost like building a Frankenstein type of score. So this student, even though they didn't get a 1290 in one administration of the test, in their folder, their SAT scores will be written as 640 reading and writing, 650 math, and they'll get credit. Essentially, that will be their SAT score. Historically, the ACT, colleges have always been reluctant to superscore the ACT, but that's changing. More and more colleges are superscoring the ACT as well, so they'll choose a student's highest, say, English, reading, math, and science scores from different administrations of that ACT, and again, recalculate those composite scores based on those highest subsection scores. And the reason why colleges are superscoring, we all kind of loathe the U.S. News and World Report rankings, but standardized testing scores are a factor in those rankings, so it is to the college's advantage to be able to report as high SAT and ACT scores as they can. And also sort of crazy things that you never probably think about, like a school's bond rating can sometimes be influenced by a college's standardized testing scores that they're reporting. So it's in the college's best interest to be able to report as high scores as they can, so that's why more and more colleges are now superscoring. And if you have any questions as to whether or not the colleges you're looking at superscore, oftentimes it's on their website, but if it's not, you can just call and ask about their testing policies, whether they honor score choice, whether they superscore, and they'll be very upfront with you. They'll tell you how they handle this. And then just in terms of quickly how to prepare for these. So good test prep essentially comes down to 3 major areas. One is content. Just knowing everything that's on the test, so knowing all the grammar rules, knowing all the math. The other is strategy, just having a game plan for every section and for every question that the student's going to see. And then the best form of practice on this is practice, practice, practice on official tests. So the College Board, there are now 7 official SAT tests that they've released. You can get them either through Khan Academy or from the College Board website. They're just as PDFs, you can download them for free. The ACT has put out a book, it's the Red Book, I think it's like the official guide to the ACT. There's only 3 practice tests in there, but if you go online, there's tons and tons of ACT tests that are available that you can also kind of download and practice. And then the one just sort of piece of advice on practice tests, and again I direct this to the students in the room, it's not just brute forcing your way through practice test after practice test after practice test and being like, hey, yay, my scores went up a little, great, I'm doing better at this. Really, the way to get scores to move on these tests and to utilize these practice tests to their greatest, for greatest maximum benefit is having the discipline to go back and look at the questions that you missed and understand why your answer is wrong, understand why the right answer is the right answer, but even more importantly, understand what led you to that wrong answer. Why did you choose that? And if you have the discipline to go back and analyze your practice test scores and look at those questions with that eye, that's how those scores are going to improve, and that's how you're going to be able to raise those scores. So just in terms of guiding principles, as you kind of think about that testing plan a little bit, here's kind of what we're thinking about as we talk with families about this. Again, most students are going to score the same. 70 or 80% of students score equally well on both, but it is worth pursuing to see if the student has a scoring bias or a strong preference for one test or the other. Because they're both curriculum-based tests, prepping for one definitely helps prep with the other. And then again, can't stress this enough. I know there's huge kind of pressure out there for early and often testing. Just keep testing, and start earlier and earlier. But students do, statistically speaking, hit their best scores at end of late spring of junior year or fall of senior year. And then I just leave you with this. A good testing plan has to prioritize schoolwork over any kind of test prep. The most important thing that colleges look at is students' grades, day in and day out performance in school, and the rigor of that transcript. Did they challenge themselves in school? So it doesn't do us any good to raise the standardized testing scores if it's at the expense of their academics and their day in and day out performance in school. And I know it's easy for me to say up here, but I just leave you with this. At the end of the day, it really is just a test. Try to have some fun with this process, and really at the end of the day, there's something like 1,200 colleges and universities out there. Really what this process is designed to do is to help you kind of take those 1,200 schools and narrow it down to a reasonable list. And just at the end of the day, you want those schools on that list to be the best fit. Like, where is that student, or where is your student going to be able to thrive socially, academically? What school is going to work best for you, kind of as a family? And just keep in mind that the best fit is not always just the most competitive school that your son can get into. I always joke that one of the nice things about college online bookstores is they're more than happy to send a bumper sticker to anyone. So go ahead and order a bumper sticker from every college you want. Just stick it on your car, and then actually pick the school that's actually going to be sort of the best fit and actually going to be the place where your son is going to thrive. And then just one other quick thing. In addition to my business card, we do have I do have a business reply card in there. We do offer webinars just on some more detailed information on this. Sort of on topics in this presentation we just didn't have time to go into depth on. And also probably our most popular presentation is in May, and I think in July, we do offer a free seminar at the Wellesley Public Library on writing the Common App. It's led by Alan Reeder from Arlington, and it's just, it's fabulous. The feedback we get from that is just great. Again, trying to just take away some of the anxiety around writing the Common App essay, and students are invited as well. And Alan, he does a great job in terms of getting students sort of excited about actually trying to write this and taking a crack at this. All right, guys, I hope that was helpful. We do offer one-on-one tutoring in home, so if you have questions or you want a little bit of support on this, also if you just want help just kind of thinking about a testing plan, don't hesitate to reach out to us. All right, thanks so much. I hope this was helpful.
A couple of things. I just want to mention a couple of things to you that you might already know, and then Drew and I will open it up to any questions that you might have. So I hope you boys are coming home really excited about the junior guidance class that we offer for once a cycle. I'm sure they come home and tell you all about it. So it started at the beginning of this semester and it runs until the end of the year. And we're covering all of the topics regarding, college applications, admissions, standardized testing, essay writing, And a lot of this will cover once again in the junior parent college night that we'll have on March 23rd. But one of the things that we have told the boys, and it's exactly what Drew was saying, is to take real tests at least twice before the end of junior year. Whether that's an SAT and an ACT, which is probably the ideal, or if he or you already know that the ACT is the test that's working, maybe taking that twice, or the SAT is the one that's working, maybe take that twice. But if your son is still up in the air and you're really uncertain as to which test will work better for him, to take one of each before the end of junior year would be ideal, and then we can look at the results of that and use our concordance table and figure out which test really is working best for him, and that can help us establish a testing plan for him as he goes into his senior year. So all of the juniors now, or most of them, have taken a pre-ACT, which they took in sophomore year. So those results should be somewhere at home. If not, we've got a copy. And that you also should have recently received copies of your son's PSAT results. So we went over that in guidance class with them. And we showed them the testing report, but we took it back so that we can have one on file for ourselves. But we did mail home the same copy to you. And your sons have the actual testing booklet. And we do tell them, as does Summit, look at the testing booklet, compare your son's answer sheet to the questions in the booklet, and that it's just as important to go over the correct answers as the incorrect, because in many cases, because of the no penalty for guessing, your son may have guessed but has absolutely no idea why you got the answer right. And so it happens, and so it's a good idea, and it's a free way to get ready for the real test. So I just wanted to mention that to you. You probably all know that our Board of Trustees finances an SAT prep course for all juniors. It's free to all juniors, so there's really absolutely no reason, I hope, why every junior wouldn't take it. We offered a fall course, we're in the middle of a winter course right now, and we'll offer one again in the summer. We'll also offer college application boot camp in the summer, but we'll talk more about that on March 23rd. And the only other thing I wanted to mention with regard to subject tests is it is true that it's a dying breed, but if your sons are finishing up a subject and they've been very, very successful, especially if it's an honors or AP level, it might be worth a conversation with us to see if this would be the year to take the SAT subject test. For sure, if he's in an AP. And it's tricky because your sons don't know where they're applying to school yet, but by the time he does know where he's applying, and perhaps realizes that, gee, I'm applying to one of those rare schools that require subject tests, if you don't already have a couple of those in the bank, then it might be more difficult to take them later on.
And those colleges that require subject tests, it's generally two. The one exception is Georgetown, which is still requiring 3.
Yeah, and on their website, they'll say they recommend 3, so read recommend is required, because that's really what it means. And so they should just say required, because that's really what it boils down to. Also, one final thing before we open it up for questions. On Drew's schedule of testing dates, you may have noticed there's an August SAT that's new. And something that may be worth considering, especially if your boys are thinking about applying early action, early decision. Those testing dates in the fall, which typically for SAT have been October and November, the November one can get a little bit tight for early action, early decision. And so if your son was hoping to take especially the SAT twice, or maybe the SAT and the subject test, so one of those testing dates up until now has had to be November, that gets a little tight for some schools. So this August date, while it's inconvenient for many because it's in the summer, and it's actually not that great for test proctors either because it's a little bit harder to recruit test proctors, it may be a test to consider, so that if you're going into that early action, early decision season, you won't find yourself caught with not enough time to take the test.